Hey everyone, I want to welcome each and every one of you on behalf of the entire American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law program here at National Headquarters for a really special presentation on Oppenheimer, the film, and the scientist that the film got its namesake from, and a look at nuclear weapons and armed conflict and the intersection that those weapons of mass destruction have with IHL, International Humanitarian Law. I'll forgive in advance my happy trigger finger on the slides. We've got a really, really great presentation for you here today, and I'm joined by two of my outstanding colleagues, Elizabeth Walsh and Christian Jorgensen. Elizabeth, I'll lead with you if you could please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much. My name is Elizabeth Walsh. I'm in my final year at Seton Hall University in New Jersey, and I'm majoring in diplomacy and international studies. I hope to go to law school, and I'm currently an intern for the IHL.
Thanks. Christian, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Jorgensen. I'm a staff attorney at the American Red Cross National Headquarters, focusing on IHL dissemination.
Thanks to you both. My name is Thomas Harper. I am the Senior Counsel for International Humanitarian Law here at the American Red Cross. And alongside Christian and a wealth of great volunteers like Elizabeth and many, many more, it's my pleasure to help lead the IHL program and the American Red Cross's effort in IHL dissemination. So without further ado, I want to jump into Oppenheimer. And before we get into any sort of analysis or dissection of history, I want to answer the why to all of this. Why are we using this movie? Why are we using this sort of box office pop culture type deal to talk about such a serious topic? What's the relevancy? Couldn't you just have an event on nuclear weapons? Couldn't you just have something disconnected to Hollywood and that sort of thing? And the answer is yes. Obviously, we could do that, and we frequently do. But Oppenheimer really showed the power of pop culture in turning the world's attention to certain issues. I would submit to you that the vast majority of the American public wasn't talking about Oppenheimer, wasn't talking on any sort of routine, widespread basis about nuclear weapons, the development of the A-bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the exception of some obvious classes in public schools and universities, et cetera, or around the time of the anniversary of the bombings, et cetera. But those are really minorities. What you had in Oppenheimer was this really unique confluence of circumstances where you had a major motion picture that ended up being a smash hit, released at the same time as another major motion picture in Barbie. And it's a movie that's not some direct to DVD or direct to video release. It's one that's made by Christopher Nolan, sort of one of the most popular filmmakers of today, the creator of the Dark Knight trilogy with the Batman series, movies like Tenet, Inception, etc. So someone with a lot of cachet in the film industry decides to turn his attention to the story of Oppenheimer and the development of nuclear weapons. And so that's a really unique moment in sort of popular conscience that turns the world's attention to that subject. And more so than any time in my lifetime that I can remember, regular, normal people, my friends, my family members, we're talking about this sort of thing. We're having conversations about J. Robert Oppenheimer, about the Manhattan Project, about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was a really unique moment for me. And I'm sure that I could speak to the experience of many folks in the audience here today. So we want to use this opportunity to I know the movie's effectively out of cinemas, but its reverberating effects continue. And I think that impact will continue. But today, Elizabeth, Christian, and I are going to take sort of a wide-spanning look. We're going to look a little more at the history than is typical for some of our webinars. We're going to sort of dissect what the movie shows versus what the real development process was like. we're going to get into the intersection of IHL quite a bit and track things all the way to present day. How has the law tried to grapple with the development of these destructive weapons and try to rein in that danger that they pose to humanity? So we're going to go on a journey here. We have a lot of stuff to cover, but I'm so excited for you to hear from both Elizabeth and Christian. And so without further ado, I want to kick it over to you, Elizabeth, to just tee us up with touching on what a nuclear bomb actually is. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what from a technical standpoint are we actually talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb or the A bomb, is described by the CDC as a device that uses a nuclear reaction to create an explosion that gives off four main types of energy. So that's a blast wave, intense heat, or intense light, heat, and radiation. Nuclear weapons create these types of energy through a process called nuclear fission, which occurs when the neutrons are forced at an atomic nucleus and the atom is split. The mushroom cloud effect that you see is most associated with nuclear weapons because it is caused by this thermonuclear reaction. The separation of the atom creates a release of extreme energy, making nuclear weapons uniquely dangerous. And as stated by the UN, nuclear weapons are the most dangerous weapons on Earth.
Now,
So,
no, go ahead. You're a step ahead of me.
no, I was just going to say, so it was created, invented, and researched and tested from 1942 to 1945. And credit to the creation goes to J. Robert Oppenheimer and the team behind the Manhattan Project. This was a top secret project, and the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the only times in human history that nuclear weapons were ever used against people.
So I want to take us, before we dive into any of Oppenheimer's work, I think it's appropriate to go across the Atlantic Ocean to Berlin, Germany. So this is Berlin circa 2023 modern day. But I want to take us back in time to Berlin in 1938. This is about what the city would have looked like before the outbreak of World War II. And specifically, I want to set the stage that at this time, the Nazi Party, Hitler and his Nazi forces are nearing the apex of their power. They've taken control of the government and the military there in Germany, and they are right on the doorstep of invading neighboring countries and lighting off what would soon be a global world war. Within Berlin, there's a institute that exists today. It existed well before 1938, and it has a sort of storied and infamous history in dual regard, but it's the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry. So some very, very famous scientists have their names attached in some way to this institute. But around 1938, you have two individuals pictured here, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, who are sort of uniquely situated. They have stumbled upon is not the right word, but they have made an incredible discovery at a very simple work table there at the Institute, pictured here. They have split the atom. They've discovered what's now known as nuclear fission, or the process by which the destructive power of the atom can be released. Now, those two scientists weren't out to create a bomb. They weren't researching anything for the Nazi Party or Hitler. They weren't even doing any military research. This is simply a major leap forward in physics at the time. And they achieved something that up to that point had only been theoretical. But it was a seminal moment in time because now the capability was there to create a reaction in which you could harness that sort of energy and potentially use it for destructive effects. And so this started us down a uniquely destructive path in the globe.
So now let's fast forward. So it's August 1939. It's a month before World War II is starting on September 1st. And scientists Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard co-signed a letter to President Delano Roosevelt expressing their concerns over the potential for powerful weaponry to be created from the discovery of nuclear fission. Fearing what the Nazis could be capable of with this type of weapon and believing they were actively funding this research for direct weapons creation, they urged the United States government to fund research into this area to match the threat. A month after World War II started, on October 19th, 1939, FDR writes them back saying that he was beginning the steps to fund research for nuclear fission. And this came in the creation of the Uranium Committee, which was a group that was researched and validated the threat of nuclear fission reactions and their potential for use to cause harm.
Now, that committee's efforts came during the sort of early days of World War II. The U.S. was not formally involved. There were no U.S. troops in active combat on behalf of the United States outside of some training missions and supply, that sort of thing. That all changed on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor is bombed by the Japanese Navy. Shortly thereafter, President Roosevelt makes a formal declaration of war in conjunction with Congress, and the U.S. is catapulted into the fight. This injects sort of a massive fire underneath the effort to develop a nuclear bomb or some sort of destructive capability out of that concept of nuclear fission. Because as you saw that in that Roosevelt quote, there is this underpinning of a dual recognition and fear, a recognition that the Nazis are no doubt pursuing this exact same technology. After all, nuclear fission was achieved in the heart of the Nazi Empire. And the fear that someone like Adolf Hitler, an entity as evil as the Nazi Party, and their military would not hesitate to use this sort of weapon. So that's the backdrop upon which the Manhattan Project is born. And the Manhattan Project is effectively an extension, an evolution of the Uranium Committee and these early efforts between 1939 and August of 1942 to advance this research.
So let's start with who was General Leslie Groves. So played by Matt Damon in the Christopher Nolan adaptation, General Leslie Richard Groves Jr. was born to a military chaplain, eventually attending West Point, where his education was fast-tracked because of America's entry into World War I. So he grew up with being around the military his entire life. He eventually attended West Point University, where his education continued, and he led the construction of the Pentagon, which positioned him one day to become the director of the Manhattan Project. As director, he appointed J. Robert Oppenheimer as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. Despite having described Oppenheimer in his book as, quote, having two major flaws, he had almost no administrative experience of any kind, and he was not a Nobel Prize winner. He is known to have described Oppenheimer in his letters as, quote, absolutely essential to the project. And this is a quote from the movie that we thought we would add in when Richard Groves is talking to the scientists and he's trying to recruit them. And they say, well, why should I bring my family? Why should we move to Los Alamos? And he responds, how about because this is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the world. So then we have the man himself, who is J. Robert Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer, played by actor Cillian Murphy, was the director, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, and became known as the American Prometheus and the father of the atomic bomb. He was born to German and Jewish parents in New York City in 1904. He studied at Harvard before moving to Cambridge to study at the Cavendish Laboratory, and went on to complete his PhD at the University of Göttingen under physicist Max Born. He is credited with bringing theoretical physics to America, and while working at the University of California, Berkeley, he published papers about black holes, cosmic ray showers, and quantum tunneling, very theoretical, out of this world things, before being asked to take over as scientific director of the Manhattan Project in 1942. So what is Los Alamos? This is where most of the scenes in the movie take place. This was a top secret location in northern New Mexico, and it became the home for scientists and their families to work intimately on the creation of the atomic bomb. People were committed there. They had schools, they had churches, they had different places of worship. They were very much committed to this. People committed their lives to this project. And at Los Alamos, to ensure maximum secrecy and maximum efficacy, the project was very highly secure. So the project was divided into subsections and very isolated projects. Some were kept so secret that many people did not know what the result of their work was until they heard about the bombings. And of course, isolated areas such as Los Alamos were chosen for their isolation from the rest of the world. Extensive background checks were done on the few that had total knowledge and understanding of their tasks, which were few and far between. Many people also moved to Los Alamos with their families, and many were not allowed to discuss the scope of what they were working on, even with them.
And I would add, Elizabeth, you mentioned Albert Einstein. Einstein was denied a security clearance. It kept him out of the Manhattan Project, coincidentally, as the then War Department noted, his sort of leftist politics, quote unquote, however they define that. But he didn't qualify and was kept on the outside of the project despite his integral effort in starting the process for this research.
Yeah, absolutely. Many scientists, as it's stressed throughout the movie, had left-wing ties, and because the success was dependent on the fact that it was kept as secret as possible, especially from Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Despite those efforts, there was information given to the Soviet Union through espionage efforts. There's no known German or Japanese spies known to have permeated the project, but there was information given to the Soviet Union during this time.
So the Manhattan Project ultimately culminates its efforts on July 16th of 1945. They're nearby Los Alamos. They don't detonate the test bomb in Los Alamos proper. It's a number of miles away. But this is known as the Trinity test, and the name Trinity is attributed to Oppenheimer. He attributes the name to a famous poet that he enjoyed very much, and the concept was tied to Christian religion and the concept of the Trinity. So he sort of steeped his work and his view of sort of his role in the death and destruction that they were potentially unleashing in biblical terms. And you're going to see that reflected in a number of individuals throughout this process because of the power and the unique destructive capability that they were unleashing. But the big takeaway with the Trinity test, and this is sort of the culminating apex moment of the movie, at least if you're into practical special effects. And I think it's obvious to say, but if you weren't aware, Christopher Nolan did that explosion with traditional virtual effects. There was no digital effects that were used, or at least not extensively in that explosion. So sort of carrying on his tradition as a filmmaker of adherence to practical effects. But this was the first the first nuclear detonation of a nuclear bomb. And it's important to note that they weren't quite sure that it would work. They absolutely weren't sure that it wouldn't just fizzle out. They also weren't sure exactly what it would do. And there's this really classic exchange between Oppenheimer and Groves in the movie, in which Oppenheimer says there's a non-zero chance that this thing ignites the atmosphere and lights all of it on fire. And Groves sort of is taken aback, and Oppenheimer is like, well, what percentage would you like? And he's like, how about zero? Right? There was they were really toying with Pandora's box, and they were aware of that, but there was this urgency that underpinned their efforts in the war effort, in the no Nazi efforts. We'll touch on the fact that this test occurred at a key point in history within the war, vis-a-vis the German war effort, but that urgency persisted. Now, there is within IHL a component that addresses how you field and research and implement new weapons. And IHL in its modern form prescribes what's known as Article 36 review. So Article 36 is just a literal section from or subsection from the Geneva Convention's Additional Protocol 1. And it mandates that high contracting parties, so everybody who's signed on to Additional Protocol 1, has to go through some process of determining whether these new weapons or these new means or methods of warfare would be prohibited by IHL. So is this means or method, so this way of warfare or this new weapon that you're researching or acquiring, is it going to break the rules and violate the law? I would key you into the date that AP1 came into existence. That's quite obviously 32 years after the Trinity test. So Article 36 reviews didn't exist at the time. I would suspect that even if Article 36 existed, Article 36 itself doesn't detail. If you open it up, if you Google it right now, you're not going to see a detailed process that a country must follow to satisfy this provision. That's left up to the state's party, or the contracting parties. They just have to go through that determination. So that can look different, and in fact, it does look different in country to country. Here in the United States, modern day, we conduct formal legal reviews, so formal Article 36 reviews of new weaponry or weaponry that's in development. There are all sorts of attorneys. We've managed to nest ourselves in all corners of society. We're like the literal mice, field mice of society, and that we've made ourselves necessary everywhere. So military attorneys, civilian attorneys are in the process of, or involved deeply in the process of these weapon reviews modern day. But that didn't happen here. There are certainly some aspects of morality that we'll touch on in a little bit, but there was no Article 36 process. There was no sort of formal weapons review. They were viewing this weaponry and the prospect of having this bomb as this sort of essential component of the war effort. I mentioned timing, and timing of the Trinity test is really, really critical here, because in May of 1945, you have the surrender of German forces. So VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is celebrated that in May. That's sort of the closure of the European theater, at least formally, even though some fighting would continue for some weeks and months after that, sporadically. But the sort of big bad in the war, at least the anchor point of the Axis forces in Nazi Germany, has fallen. So that Roosevelt quote and all of those concerns from Einstein and others about whether and what would happen if the Nazis acquired a bomb, suddenly those are mooted as of May 1945. That's no longer a serious concern. Yet the US government and the Allies go forward with the Trinity test, and in fact with the bombings in August. And so the question is, why? Why, if your main sort of rival that you're worried about developing the bomb is out of the fight, why is there a necessity to continue the research and ultimately employ the weapon shortly thereafter? So there's a great quote from the movie that speaks to the sort of inevitability, if you will, of the use of the bomb. So Oppenheimer looked at this creation and the potential destruction through the lens of recognizing in some respect what they were potentially about to unleash, but realizing that there was this sort of inertia to the whole, not just to the war effort, but to the Manhattan Project, to the development of the bomb itself. Significant resources, significant personnel power had gone into all of this. And he says they, meaning sort of the powers that be, political forces, military forces, they won't fear it until they understand it. And they're not going to understand it until they've used it. So he viewed the use of the weapon as an inevitability, but tried to square that inevitability with this idea in his own mind that seeing its destructive effects would somehow be the start and the end point of nuclear warfare, that that moment in time, that reality would dawn, and you would then have a desire to completely move away from this type of weaponry. So it's an odd juxtaposition there, but that's sort of an encapsulation of the moral struggle that Oppenheimer went through. That's buttressed, as is the case with all of the scientists working on this, with all of those who touch this project in some way, with the realities of the conflict that they were fighting in. So the Trinity test happens in July, and very, very shortly thereafter, the U.S. turns its attention to actually using the bomb in active armed combat. And the process for that is muddled by, most importantly these days, hindsight. Hindsight's 2020. We have access to all of this information that we, those that were in the moment didn't have. But it's important to sort of unpack just a little bit some of the confluence of circumstances that were happening at the time that influenced the use of the two bombs. All too often, at least in my own education, it's the use of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are presented as this analog. The U.S. had to use these weapons. This was a clear-eyed view of the weapons being necessary to end the war and therefore save or forestall a massively destructive potential invasion of Japan, which was the only way to get Japan to surrender. It's seen as that sort of analog where if we don't use the bomb, or if we hadn't used the bombs, then the latter would have come true and many deaths would have happened, etc. But the reality is much more complicated than that. And this isn't about pointing out rights or wrongs in all of this, but this is about illustrating and painting a picture of the complexity that existed here. You have the confluence of these factors, and I've really simplified it here, but we'll walk through each of them briefly because all of them played a role in the ultimate decision to use the bombs. So we'll start with war weariness. And this comes in multiple forms. So I mentioned VE Day in May of 1945. And what you have there is an American army and an allied force writ large that has been at war in one way or another for the US since 1941 or early 1942, and for the Allies even earlier than that. If you talk Czechoslovakia and Polish forces, you go back all the way to 1939. So the US public that we sort of visualize or that's been ingrained in pop culture is this like very supportive American public that is ready to go, ready to sacrifice no matter what, and the war effort trumps all, and everybody waves a flag. But the reality was much more complicated than that. By 1945, by July, even after Germany had been defeated, the public was growing weary of the war. This is year upon year of tremendous sacrifice of, an incalculable amount of death and suffering of people's families, family members. Almost everybody in American society has been touched by this war, and it's dragged on for quite a while. Although in hindsight, 4 years doesn't seem like a lot, but it really is this tremendous weight upon American society. You also have a weariness amongst the troops, troops that have been fighting. We talk about modern day deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan. In these, I spent 12 months in Afghanistan. That's sort of the typical rotation. Then you go home for a year or two, and then maybe you deploy again at some point later in your career. That wasn't the experience for American troops. They're in active combat. There is no sort of rotational in and out like we're familiar with in the War on Terror. And so even amongst Allied troops, and in particular those who are fighting in Europe, the prospect of continuing the war and redeploying out to the Pacific for a grueling campaign to invade Japan, this was a real drag on morale, and it was causing a tremendous amount of worry within the higher ranks of the U.S. military that this could seriously impact our fighting ability. Elsewhere, you had a tremendous amount of anxiety both within the government, the military, and obviously the public. Around this time or leading into 1945, you had these two devastating campaigns in Okinawa and Iwo Jima. So these are island hop or two campaigns, two of the major battles as part of the U.S. Pacific effort to retake islands in vicinity of Japan. These were tremendously bloody battles, and I highlight Okinawa and Iwo Jima in particular because they highlighted the ferocity with which the Japanese armed forces fought. I mean, these were fights to the death, to the man on these two islands that exacted a tremendous toll from both sides. And the U.S. military, the U.S. government saw this through clear eyes, and this colored the perception. If the Japanese are willing to fight to these lengths to defend these two islands, very remote islands in the Pacific, what are they going to do to defend their homeland? To what length will the Japanese public go to defend their homeland? And so the perception at the time, as colored by our campaign in the Pacific, was that this was going to be very costly, that they would face incredibly stiff resistance, and that it would exact a tremendous toll. Likewise, within the military sphere, you had active planning for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. The operation, so this top secret Operation Downfall, was in the works. The first landings down there on Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese island, were scheduled to start in November of 1945. And this was sort of a fully fleshed out plan. You had troops that were actively being redeployed and mustered in order to facilitate this invasion. So this wasn't theoretical. This was a reality that the U.S. military was planning for. They're mustering upwards of 1 million plus men to fight this battle in anticipation that that's what it's going to take to defeat Japan on at its home. And they estimated that around 20,000 or more would be killed, not just wounded. I'm not talking casualties writ large to include wounded, but 20,000 killed in the first month of that operation. So they're understand that these are coloring the perception of those planners, those decision makers. They have to, by necessity of just the war effort, make plans for this because they don't know whether the bombs are going to work. And so this is a sort of staggering toll to pay to end the war in the Pacific. They didn't have any of the hindsight that we have about the current state of the Japanese government or the Japanese military, what the overall feeling was amongst the Japanese people. A lot of that was information that maybe they had bits and pieces of, but they don't have the 2023 view of things. What they have is a really extensive mission that's on deck with men being positioned to go, and one that's going to cost a tremendous number of lives. So you also had a number, as you do in any armed conflict, of geopolitical forces that are swirling about here. Of note, the Manhattan Project was a tremendous investment. So you had the U.S. military that had spent, in the government, that had spent years on this project, upwards of $2 billion in 1940s money, which, to account for inflation, all those things, is probably about 27 billion in today's dollars. This was a project that they had gone all in on and viewed it as sort of a key effort. And the idea of having a singular weapon that could end the conflict was viewed as a unique tool. It wasn't viewed with the sort of, again, hindsight that we have today of the destructive potential, because they really didn't fully grasp what it could do. They understood sort of the scope and what they were trying to achieve, but they didn't have the sort of history that we have now behind the bomb and the ripple effects that would occur. Also importantly is the Soviet Union. While the Soviets were part of the Allied forces at the time, a number of U.S. military and political leaders saw the USSR as an ally who would soon turn to be a rival. Elizabeth mentioned the business of Soviet spies and the passing of information to the Soviets. We were well aware that the Soviets had a nuclear program. They were researching, trying to develop a bomb of their own. And on some levels, there was a pressure to use the bomb to demonstrate, A, that we had it to the Soviets, and B, what it could do when used in conflict, and that we were willing to use it in conflict as a sort of twisted means of deterrence. So those forces are going on. And you also had a deep distrust among the American public that has lingered about the Japanese and Japanese forces. So Pearl Harbor is still right at the center of folks' memory. That the destruction from that attack is still reverberates through American society. You also had the news of the Bataan Death March, and images like this infamous one on the right of the execution of a U.S. POW that had really inflamed the public. So while we're used to sort of at least a measured debate about use of force and humanity in war and whatnot, there was a real anger that was prevalent in the American public about the way that Japan had prosecuted the war. And there was a distrust that any attempt to negotiate with Japan for terms of surrender or try to cut a deal just would be met with some sort of betrayal or dishonor, that they wouldn't uphold their end of the bargain. So if you look back at sort of public opinion polling and whatnot, there was a resounding sort of unification around that anger and distrust of Japan that absolutely factored into things. Equally as important as these other three were the personalities that were involved. And I'm really glad that, Elizabeth, you touched on some of the key players, but it's important to note that President Truman became President Truman just a few months before the bomb was used. So around April, he becomes president. And again, hindsight is this common thread in this entire presentation. Hindsight of President Truman, he's the guy with the buck stops here placard on his desk. He's decisive, etc. And certainly he may have been in some regards, but he was really shocked to come into that role so suddenly at such a point during the war. There's a quote from him where he worries that he's not big enough for the moment. He has this worry that he's not built for this moment, and it's influenced by sort of a lifetime of having a chip on his shoulder for a variety of reasons we won't get into today. But his temperament was one of standing in the shadow, the legacy of FDR, a man that he served as vice president for and regarded very highly, as did the American public. I can't think of any better embodiment than the fact that he kept an image or a picture of Roosevelt in his office and would consistently say that he was just trying to do right by FDR. He was trying to honor the late president's legacy, etc. And so that would influence his decision making. And General Groves, who Elizabeth introduced you to, was an equal force of personality. This is a man with, he had a lot of things. Hubris was probably the thing he had in spades. And General Groves had his entire personality and professional career sort of hitched to the Manhattan Project. This was his baby. He had earned that spot, however you want to characterize that, by virtue of his role in building the Pentagon and leading that project. And he sort of outwardly acknowledged that failure of the project, if the project failed to yield a successful bomb, or if the bomb fizzled in use during conflict, that this would all come back to him, that certainly it would in some way impact FDR's legacy, but FDR is dead. General Groves is alive and would ultimately go on to continue in the military. This would affect his legacy. That seems twisted to think, but you can't separate the human aspect of people that are involved in these decisions from the events of history themselves. So that hubris played a big role. And he was the leader of the project. As much as Oppenheimer was the scientific brain behind this, the A-bomb, General Groves was sort of the embodiment of the U.S. government's investment and effort here. And he weighed heavily on President Truman. He understood that President Truman was in a very unique position. He understood President Truman's view of FDR and his desire to honor his legacy. And his view, General Groves' view, was that the president's role was to acquiesce and go along with the recommendations that he provided, namely that the bomb needed to be used. And he described Truman at one point as being like a little boy on a toboggan not being the hat, as we called it when I was growing up in North Carolina, but the sled. So being led around on a sled to the decisions that he wanted him to make. And he exercised that pressure on Truman. He said, hey, a failure of this project, failure to use this bomb to show its destructive effects, it's not just going to impact or reflect on FDR, which Truman held in high regard. That very much influenced Truman, but it's going to impact you too. Your sort of opening legacy will be this failure, and you will have failed one of the people that you looked up to most in life in FDR in the process. Right in the middle of all this is the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. So Stimson is in his late 70s around this time. He's this sort of old school classical gentleman. He believes very deeply in sort of professionalism in the conduct of warfare, sort of the underpinnings of IHL as a whole, this idea that war needed to be fought by a set of rules. And Stimson was this sort of check on General Groves and his desires. And Stimson played that role in a larger respect with regard to how the war was being prosecuted in other ways that I'll touch on in just a second here. So all of that combines, and you get to the business of where are they going to potentially use these bombs. And they very quickly center on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Hiroshima was decided upon first. And a similar confluence of circumstances led to the decision to target Hiroshima. A normal targeting process would look very, very different than the one that was set behind the business of using these atomic bombs. I think on some level, the political and the military leaders recognized sort of somewhat the weight of the moment, but there was an inertia at this point that the bomb needed to be used for a variety of reasons. What impacted the decision on targeting, among others, was that the U.S. was actively, or the Allies led by the U.S. was actively involved in an extensive bombing campaign on the Japanese mainland. So sort of notoriously under General Curtis LeMay, who was commander of U.S. Air Forces there, our B-29 bomber fleet had been on an active firebombing campaign. This is a tremendously destructive bombing campaign targeting city centers, leveling them, setting widespread fires, and causing tens of thousands of deaths. So just in March of 1945, firebombing of Tokyo left more than 100,000 people dead during that campaign. And that seems absolutely shocking and twisted as we look back on this. How could the U.S. do something like that? But I would submit to you, setting aside the manner in which this was prosecuted, the business of targeting city centers, of subjecting civilian populations to this kind of death and destruction had become commonplace in World War II. That's not a judgment on the rightness or wrongness of it, but going back to the early days of the London Blitz, in which the Nazis fired missiles routinely or sent bombs or bombing runs into London, there was a common practice that rapidly developed of targeting these city centers as a means of punishing the enemy and inflicting as much damage as one could. This was part of what ultimately led to the Geneva Conventions that followed World War II in the late 40s. So the bottom line here is that this firebombing, or this bombing campaign across Japan, had really limited the number of targets. And I say limited because what General Groves sort of saw was a need to have a sort of untouched city or an untouched place in which the bomb could be used to fully demonstrate its destructive effects. If it were dropped on a city that had already been firebombed, as sort of twisted as this sounds, it would be difficult to determine what was caused by the atomic bomb and what was caused by the pre-existing damage from the fire campaign. So again, you have that personality that's injected in there in the decision-making process. So that influences things. And General Groves' first recommendation, his first idea is to target Kyoto. So Kyoto is the cultural capital of Japan. General Groves knew this full well, and in fact, circled Kyoto as a target, in his words, to leave sort of this lasting cultural memory, to really send home to the Japanese people the impact of this bomb, and to sort of have maximum devastating impact on the populace and the psyche of Japanese citizens. Henry Stimson had visited Kyoto. Henry Stimson saw Kyoto for what it was, as a cultural center, a place that was the sort of seat of power for the Japanese emperor. Saw the potential devastation for humanity if a location like Kyoto were to be targeted. And I think also influencing that was the idea that if you killed the Japanese emperor in a strike like this, that could very well have the exact opposite effect of trying to end the war. It could inflame things further and send the Allies further down a spiral of a never-ending conflict. So Stimson vehemently rejected Kyoto as a target. They ended up moving off of Kyoto and targeting Hiroshima. And the question that's often raised in hindsight is whether peace was possible. Was it possible to have an off-ramp to not use the bomb? And Stimson made an attempt to this. And what's surprising when you look back at primary source documents is that there was not much of a debate over the ability to merely threaten to use the bomb in an effort to curtail the war. But also there was a limited amount of information that was flowing to the Allies and a limited ability to negotiate peace at this time. There were indications that the Japanese, through intercepted cables, had reached out diplomatically or begun reaching out to the Soviets to explore the possibility of a peace process. This sort of cut against the visage of the Japanese emperor as this warmonger, and sort of revealed his true status as someone who was a political actor that was acting, at least in some ways rationally, contrary to what had been publicized about him. But not all of that information was available at all levels of the government. You don't have the internet back then. You don't have the sort of interconnectivity that you have today. And so there wasn't a realistic pathway, at least in terms of our understanding or knowledge of how serious Japan might have been with their desire for peace prior to the dropping of the bombs. But you did have Stimson in a meeting, in an Oval Office meeting with the Joint Chiefs, with his chief assistant, a man by the name of John McCloy, who proposed the idea of threatening to use the bomb and offering Japan the chance to surrender, with the caveat that the emperor could retain his throne, albeit some reduced capacity of power. That was rejected outright for a number of reasons. There really wasn't a lot of length to that meeting, or there wasn't any sort of series of debates about that point. It was viewed as too risky. There were too many unknowns from the U.S. government's standpoint. What the Japanese might do. You have included in there the business of that distrust that I mentioned earlier. Certainly that exists with the U.S. public, and that's mirrored in our elected officials and military officials at the time. And there was a view that Japan was not susceptible to reason, that they were not rational actors. And so all of this was influencing the U.S. view that peace was not possible at this time, that a blow was needed to end the war, either by virtue of an invasion or the use of a devastating weapon like the atomic bomb. So Hiroshima ends up being targeted in large part because of its geography. It's a city that hasn't been touched by that firebombing campaign, so it's sort of twistedly available to show the destructive capability. But also the geography of that area would give it a focusing effect for the blast. So the sort of military planners viewed this as an ideal geographical location for the target to maximize the effect of the bomb. And in the wake of Hiroshima, I think Truman writes that or records that he had instructed Stimson and Groves that no military, no civilian targets were to be targeted, no women, no children, that it was only military targets. But as you'll hear Christian discuss in just a couple minutes, that really was impossible with the bomb. I think Truman's effort in doing that was sort of a papering over from a moral standpoint of what they understood to be an inevitable destruction of this city. So on August 6, 1945, a U.S. B-29 bomber known as the Enola Gay drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And the pilots, as they flew away, or the air crew, as they flew away, are noted to have described Hiroshima as a pot of boiling black oil. That's what the city looked like. And Elizabeth will talk momentarily about the devastating effects of these weapons in those usages. To the extent that there was minimal debate about Hiroshima and targeting and the existence or presence of civilians, there was little to no discussion about Nagasaki. The targeting and the decision was left to General Groves. There was no such Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting or White House meeting. By that point, you have that sort of inertia and inevitability that leads 72 hours later to the bombing of Nagasaki on the 9th. Groves wanted to demonstrate a different type of atomic bomb. So the Hiroshima bomb was a trigger type bomb. The Nagasaki bomb was an implosion type bomb. He had this sort of hubris driven desire to show that both would work and both had a high degree of destructive capabilities. Interestingly, in the interim, Japan was ready to surrender before the bombing of Nagasaki, but the decision to drop the second bomb won out, recognizing a lot of those factors that I've touched on previously. Over to you, Elizabeth.
So the dropping of the bomb obviously caused unprecedented disasters never before experienced by mankind. In the humanitarian and environmental world, the first bomb, which was nicknamed Little Boy, that was dropped over Hiroshima, resulted in 140,000 deaths, and over 70% of the city was burnt or singed. Countless others experienced long-term impacts of radiation exposure, such as leukemia, cancer, and blindness from the light. The second bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki was nicknamed Fat Man and was dropped with approximately 74,000 deaths. Ground temperatures at Nagasaki reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, and right after it was dropped, radioactive rain fell over the city, and 14,000 homes were destroyed. So obviously, this was a massive humanitarian disaster never before experienced. And the people who survived or that were just outside of the blast radius experienced long-term psychological and physical impacts. The survivors are actually recognized by the Japanese government as hibakusha. They're a population of 650,000 people that the Japanese government recognizes, and they are entitled to financial government support. Not only did these people, the hibakusha, experience these physical and mental consequences, but they were also discriminated against in work prospects, marriage potential, and there was a belief that they were contagious, that the radiation was contagious to others. So there was a lot of misinformation, and it was overall a disaster. Environmentally, it was also a disaster. All life in the radius of the explosion was destroyed. Water sources were contaminated. The soil was destroyed. Neither city was never completely uninhabitable. The restoration process took probably about 2 years, and then it took about another 8 years for the population to return to its pre-war population. Um, and this was because the bombs were detonated above the ground. So at Los Alamos, they were detonated on the ground, but in these two sites, they were detonated above. So that's why that there was able to be a rebuilding after this. So after the bombing on Nagasaki on September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed their surrender aboard the USS Missouri. In the following years, the Soviet Union during the Cold War consistently called the dropping of the bomb a war crime. But the overall global response was one that realized that nuclear weapons were now a fundamental part of war, a fundamental part of their own country's survival, and sorry, and putting politics aside, they also realized that they needed humanitarian aid and they needed humanitarian assistance, and they had to prepare for attacks like these. So the Japanese Red Cross Society did a fantastic job, and these heroes went into the radioactive zone. They faced danger and they risked their own health. They're internationally recognized as being almost, quote, they're described as, quote, quasi soldiers, because they entered these zones without fear for their own lives. They did it as they needed to do. These healthcare professionals, volunteers, and heroes honestly deserve their own movie, and you can go into them forever. They were brave and courageous. Yeah.
So in the wake of World War II, you had two major sources of legal accountability for IHL war crimes, IHL violations, war crimes. That's at Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials. Interestingly, and this is sort of a concept of victor's justice, right? There are no U.S. war crimes trials. There's the crew of the Enola Gay, General Groves, none of them are facing any sort of adverse action here, and there's a lot that goes into that sort of decision-making process and whatnot. But I think that the most poignant sort of quote in this entire sphere, General Curtis LeMay, who I mentioned, is the sort of leader of U.S. Air Forces in Japan at the end of the war, commented later that he supposed he would have been tried for war crimes had he not had the U.S. not won the war. So it's just a reflection here that there was not a formal sort of adjudication of the use of the atomic bombs, whether they violated IHL or anything like that. The trials really focused on violations by Japanese, German, and other Axis forces there following the war.
So in the years following the dropping of the bomb, Oppenheimer absolutely left a legacy of advocacy. He became the advisor of the Atomic Energy Commission and widely spoke out against the creation of larger weapons of mass destruction. In the movie, he talks a lot about his disapproval of the H-bomb. And he spoke about the necessity of international arms talk, which was also mentioned in the movie. But his guilt seemingly overtook him in the years following the bomb drop. It's shown in the movie, and it is known that he said to President Truman, "Mr. President, I feel as though I have blood on my hands." Which Truman replied, "Do you think anyone in Hiroshima or Nagasaki cares who built the bomb? They care who dropped it. I did." So whereas Oppenheimer felt great guilt, President Truman is known to have said that he would have done it again under the same circumstances. In a letter to his sister Mary, Truman is known to have written, quote, "It was a terrible decision, but I made it. And I made it to save 250,000 boys from the United States. And I'd make it again under similar circumstances." So when the bombs were dropped, not only did national politics change, but international law and foreign policy changed forever. Anti-proliferation groups rose, such as the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Friends of the Earth International, Nuclear Free World Policy, the list goes on. And then there are also countless arms deals and arms talks. Um, the differing response, and Thomas touched on this earlier, to the bomb, it's a juxtaposition of the increased weapons development, proliferation, and testing that was now necessary in this world post nuclear weapons, and also a global outcry and a global pushback. Um, Another important thing, as Thomas mentioned earlier, is that there is always, and it's mentioned like very much throughout the film, it's very much a key point, is that every time an atomic weapon is detonated, there is a small percentage that the atmosphere could catch fire in an uncontrollable chain reaction. And this is a very dramatic thing to think about, but it's true. And with this knowledge, we must take every preventative measure to educate ourselves about the detonation of nuclear weapons, to educate ourselves, and to be aware of the laws and treaties of nuclear proliferation for ourselves and for the world.
Thanks. Christian, why don't you educate us about the intersection with IHL, nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so the use of nuclear weapons is kind of a contentious issue. And so as a lawyer, some people always ask me, is it legal to use nuclear weapons? And I have to unfortunately give them the lawyer answer. And it's not the one that says it depends, but I guess it depends who you ask. Because there's differing sides to the opinion. So currently, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, the nuclear powers that do exist, there is no per se treaty that says you can't use nuclear weapons. However, by default, all nuclear weapons use must adhere to the IHL principles, stuff that's already established in international humanitarian law, and that determines which means and methods that aren't strictly prohibited per se must adhere to, and that's military necessity, distinction, proportionality, and limiting unnecessary suffering, also referred to as the principle of humanity. And then to some, there's a fifth principle of precautions. So one principle often invoked in this is military necessity. And military necessity, for those of you who are unaware, is the principle that justify actions needed to defeat the enemy efficiently. However, I mentioned a bunch of other principles. So if you just look at that one, it makes it seem pretty open-ended, but that principle doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to still adhere to the other principles I mentioned, most notably distinction and proportionality. So regarding distinction, military action, so the use of nuclear weapons, must exclusively target military objectives. These objectives are determined by their nature, use, location, or purpose. Purpose is meaning intended future use, which also leaves some wiggle room to define that or to make that determination. So this requirement aims to minimize the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure, requires militaries to consider what they're exactly targeting, to be very specific about what they're targeting. However, the complexity arises in this when we consider the principle of proportionality, which states that any incidental harm, by that I mean what is commonly referred to as collateral damage, which is the loss to civilian life or civilian objects, must not be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained from the operation. And that's determined based on the information available and kind of determined by would a reasonable commander have made the same decision with the information available. And so I just want to also highlight, when we talk about proportionality, I said anticipated military advantage gained, it's not viewed in after it happens, was the military advantage gained? Did it outweigh the loss of collateral damage? No, you have to make that determination beforehand. And so a violation of proportionality also isn't done in hindsight at the same time by saying that. So this is where nuclear weapons create a dilemma. Their destructive capability and the resulting collateral damage make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to adhere to the principle of proportionality. So it leaves people grappling with the difficult question, especially lawyers who work in this, is what constitutes a sufficient military advantage to justify such destructive weapons and the collateral damage that ensues. So I said earlier, it depends who you ask. Some people will say that it's impossible. You can't use them whatsoever, full stop. Other people point to other theories, and some of those theories are supported by statements international case law, most notably the International Court of Justice has held that nuclear weapons might be permissible in extreme circumstances where a state's survival is at stake. And then we add an extra complication to that because they don't define what state survival is. And then you have a new debate there if that's the opinion that you lean towards. So yet in these situations, the use of such weapons have to be proportionate in compliance with IHL because they're not per se illegal. And then you go into a debate based on the circumstances that is there a military advantage to be gained with the destructive effects? And so the primary opinion is that it is very, very difficult for the use of nuclear weapons to be used lawfully. But then we have this caveat that says, but ... like name your extreme circumstance where maybe. So the legal and ethical situation surrounding nuclear weapons usage is not fully resolved. And so it leaves us in some precarious moral and legal landscapes. And the world has attempted to answer that by addressing a various amount of treaties as much as possible to get consensus. Because I'm telling you that a lot of states don't even agree on this. And so the next thing that I also want to talk about is there have been other attempts to let's ignore the per se violations and the principles. What about the poisonous effects? Because IHL does prohibit the use of weapons that are poisonous weapons, we'll say. But then if you look at it further, the interpretation of that is that it makes weapons that are used because of the poisonous effects, not the incidental poisonous aftermath that might result from it. And then if you even go as far as to look at it, is okay, well, what is a poisonous weapon in that instance? And here the law and case law states that we're talking about people dipping bullets in poison. We're talking about poisoning food and water. That's what we mean by intentional effects of using poisonous weapons and not incidental poisonous effects aftermath. And I also wanted to talk about this because the reason we started talking about poisonous weapons outside of nuclear weapons is there's that scene in this movie, if I had to connect it to the film, where Oppenheimer, and this is debated if it actually happened or not, but poisoned that apple. And I was talking to Thomas and Elizabeth and saying if that was a war between him and his professor, that would be a strict violation of IHL doing that. But I do want to say it's a movie and there's debate on if that actually happened. But if you were using poisonous apples in IHL, I can tell you strictly that it's a violation. You can't do that at all. But that's because you're intentionally using poison as the weapon in that object and not incidentally, that poisonous after effects. So that's the debate about nuclear weapons. We've tried our best to do that. And like I mentioned, another attempt to try to address this issue, since we seem to have such a big disagreement or between certain parties about the legality of using nuclear weapons, we've attempted to limit this risk in different ways. And that started shortly after World War II. Most notably, the Antarctic Treaty, which bans testing in the Arctic. There's one right before that I do think is important, but it's not necessarily nuclear weapons use. It's the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which promotes peaceful use of nuclear energy. I just thought that was something to mention. But we've also seen that there's nuclear non-proliferation treaties, which prevents the growth of nuclear weapons, promotes disarmament, and again promotes peaceful use of nuclear weapons. There's even an outer space treaty. There's lots of components to it, but then we always find ways to enter this nuclear weapons issue in there. So in the outer space treaty, they ban stationing weapons of mass destruction in space. Same for the Seabed Arms Control Treaty, which bans stationing weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, on the ocean floor. And then, you'll see on the slide here that it says there's a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That's really the first strong attempt to make an international ban on both the possession and use and existence of nuclear weapons. But there's been sub-regional treaties within that have done the same thing. So in Latin America, it's illegal to manufacture, transport, hold nuclear weapons, use nuclear weapons as well. And then we also see stuff in the South Pacific along the same lines, in Africa as well. So there's been sub-regional treaties as well. The issue is that in most of these regions, if not all of them, they're not nuclear weapons countries currently. And so it makes it harder to discuss when you're talking about people who already have them, their adversaries have them. And so this is going to continue to be a political debate moving forward. But since it will be a political debate, it's important for people to the best of their ability, understand what the law says about it currently. So that's the law. And I think it's super interesting. So thanks for letting me talk and have a diatribe about that.
No, thanks, Christian. I know we're out of we're over time, and I appreciate the 94 of you who are still with us. I want to end with a question for you, Elizabeth. And you're a massive fan of the movie, and this is a topic that is at the center of your studies right now as a young professional. If Oppenheimer were alive today, what do you think his view would be of where society stands with regard to nuclear weapons?
Well, it's hard to tell. As we've seen throughout history, since the creation of the atomic bomb, perceptions change. Some people have seemed throughout Oppenheimer. You see General Groves in the interrogation room when he's asked, "Would you hire the scientists that you did again based on the new regulations?" And he says no. And he also says that he wouldn't hire Oppenheimer. So when it comes to nuclear weapons, who's creating them, who has access to them, it's a very tricky question. Oppenheimer was all for building the bomb throughout the whole movie, throughout his life. And then after it was dropped, he feels a great regret and he thought he had blood on his hands. Not only this, but approximately 20 years after the bombs were dropped, the US was on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it fundamentally changed the functioning of international humanitarian law, of national security, and of international relations. So it's very hard to say, but I think all of that leads to the main point where that's why it's important for us to continue to educate ourselves on the possibility of nuclear destruction, to not forget about it, to realize while it is in the past, it can also be in the future. And we have to listen to the experience of the survivors, the Hibakusha, remember the lives that were lost, and do what we can to prevent nuclear proliferation.
Exceptionally well said, and both your comments, your attendance to those in the audience at an event today is a reverberation of the impact that something like a movie like Oppenheimer can make. All too often, I think our society drifts in and out of paying attention to certain issues, and sort of like paying attention to sports teams. Like, hey, when the baseball team in your state is doing great and on its way to the World Series, like suddenly I'm paying attention. But when they get knocked out, I go back to not watching baseball anymore. And in some regards, public attention to nuclear weapons and the threat that they pose is akin to that. But I thank you for your presentation, Elizabeth. You did fantastically. You'd have everybody fooled if they knew you were a college student and not an IHL professional, because you hold yourself exceptionally well. And Christian, thank you as well for your always excellent legal insights. To those that are in the audience, if you have a desire to learn more about our program, you can use these two QR codes to do that. On the left, you're able to sign up, just provide your name and email address, and you'll get onto our mailing list. We send out a regular webinar flyer, so a list of the webinars that are coming up each month. That list is ever changing. You can also find our YouTube channel, which has our entire repository of recordings on the right. We carefully curate that, and it's a great place to go back to rewatch or to watch new content from all corners of IHL. We also have some important upcoming events. Next Tuesday, and sort of a fun pop culture twist, we're going to do Halloween in IHL. So we're going to look at some scary movies, zombie movies, try to draw out some IHL lessons in all of those. And that's a good way. We're doing it on Halloween at noon, so it'll be well before any trick-or-treating or anything like that. But a good way to sort of ring in the day. Costumes are welcomed. I'll probably have some Jedi robes or something like that on. So please come out to that. Right on the heels, we have another one of our interns, Olivia Kempf, who is presenting on autonomous weapons and IHL on November 3rd at noon. So this is going to be a fantastic event and one that could not be more relevant to what's happening today. Just look at any news coming out of the Ukraine conflict, and you'll see just how important this issue is. And then as a very special event on November 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, for the first time ever, the American Red Cross IHL program is partnering with the Japanese Red Cross Society and some of their youth volunteers, as well as the Tokyo delegation of the ICRC, to put on a special event showcasing youth perspectives on nuclear weapons. This is going to be a really rare and unique opportunity to see youth, including Elizabeth here. You'll get to see her in action again as they engage in a conversation with Japanese youth about their shared experiences and what their different cultures are and the attitudes are with regard to nuclear weapons. So we're really excited about this. We are very, very thankful to the Japanese Red Cross Society for partnering with us on this, as well as the ICRC. This event has been a long time in the making, and so we hope to see you there for that one as well, the evening of November 6th. We're way over time, so I'm not going to open up the questions. We'll look to connect with all of you offline. You can find Christian and I either via our website, redcross.org/IHL, so redcross.org/IHL, or you can email us. You can reach me at thomas.harper@redcross.org. That's HARPER. Or Christian.Jorgensen, Jorgensen with an E, at redcross.org. We're happy to connect with you offline. I want to say thank you for hanging on well after time. We appreciate all of your attention and the time you've taken to spend with us today. Elizabeth, Christian, thank you once again for an exceptionally job well done. And we hope to see you next week on Halloween, in costume, no less. Take care, everyone.